Snow fell in slow, deliberate patterns across the windowsill, softening the edges of the world outside. Inside, Eliot moved with quiet precision, each gesture deliberate as he arranged the tea set on the mahogany table. The porcelain cups, rimmed with faded gold, had not been touched in years. He polished them with a care that bordered on reverence, as if they were sacred tools for a ritual long delayed. He had spent the morning preparing everything, the tablecloth pressed flat, the tea blend measured with fingers that trembled only slightly, and the fire coaxed into a steady flame. It wasn't just about tea. It never had been. This was about something left unsaid for far too long, something he no longer wanted to carry inside. Julian would be there soon. That name alone stirred something beneath Eliot's ribs, a strange mixture of ache and anticipation. Years ago, Julian had been more than a friend, though never quite a lover. Their history was littered with glances that lasted too long, words cut short, touches that hovered but never landed. Eliot remembered them all, even the silences. They hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. Eliot's invitation had arrived without explanation, just a short note in careful ink. "If you're ever passing through, the kettle's always warm." He hadn't expected Julian to come, yet here he was. The doorbell rang, quiet and composed, just like Julian himself. Eliot didn't rush to answer. He let the sound hang in the air before walking to the door, smoothing the front of his sweater, as if it might hide the storm within. Julian looked almost exactly the same, slightly older, the faintest gray at his temples, but still cloaked in that same calm, unreadable charm. He smiled when their eyes met, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a long time," Julian said. Eliot stepped aside to let him in. "And yet you came." They didn't hug, they never had. Instead, Julian placed his coat on the rack, his presence filling the room with an invisible weight. "I wasn't sure I'd be welcome," Julian said, his gaze flicking to the fire, the table, the cups. "I invited you," Eliot replied, his voice even. The tea was already steeping. Eliot poured it carefully, letting the steam rise between them like a curtain. Julian took the cup with a slight nod, examining it as if searching for something. "It smells different," he murmured. "It's an old blend," Eliot said. "Meant for memory." They drank in silence, the only sound the gentle crackling of the fire. Julian glanced around the room, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "I've missed this," he said. Eliot met his gaze. "I haven't." For a moment, Julian looked as if he might speak, but then he smiled faintly and sipped his tea instead. Eliot watched him, not with affection, but with quiet resolve. This was not a reunion. It was a reckoning dressed in warmth and civility. And the tea had only just begun to work. The tea in Julian's hands trembled slightly, though he masked it well. Eliot noticed. It was the kind of detail he never missed, but he said nothing. The fire cast long shadows against the walls, flickering over framed photographs and shelves lined with unread books. This room had once held warmth. Now, it simply held them. Julian leaned back, his posture easy, but his eyes flickered too often, between Eliot's face and the fire, the table and his cup. "This place hasn't changed," he said, as if small talk could sweep away the years. Eliot smiled, but there was no softness in it, unlike some things. That silence, sharp and sudden, settled like frost. Julian looked away. He always had, whenever things turned too real. Eliot had once mistaken that evasiveness for gentleness. Now he recognized it as cowardice. "You." "Still make that tea," Julian said, lifting the cup. "The one with honey and dried violet." Eliot nodded. "You used to say it reminded you of spring." Julian chuckled, low and tired. "I used to say a lot of things." Eliot didn't respond. He let the words settle, absorbing their weight. 3 years ago, this same man had sat on this same couch, whispering poetry and brushing Eliot's fingertips under the table. It had never been declared, but it had been felt. So deeply, Eliot once believed it was love. But love doesn't disappear in unanswered texts. It doesn't flinch from difficult conversations. It doesn't vanish without goodbye, only to reappear in photos with someone else, someone smiling beside Julian like they'd been there all along. "You left without explanation," Eliot said quietly, not as an accusation, but a statement of record. Julian looked up, expression guarded. "I didn't know how to explain something I didn't understand myself." "That's not true," Eliot replied. "You just didn't want to be the villain." Julian's eyes darkened. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did." Eliot folded his hands. "And then you pretended it didn't happen." Outside, the snow thickened. The world was quiet, muffled by winter's hush. Inside, a deeper quiet unfurled, one born not from peace but from years of things left unsaid. Julian shifted in his seat, his voice thinner now. "I thought about writing, so many times, but I kept telling myself it was better to let things rest." "Rest," Eliot echoed. "Like burying a body." Julian flinched, just barely, but Eliot saw it, and for the first time, he felt something almost like satisfaction. Not from cruelty, but from truth finally spoken aloud. "I didn't come to fight," Julian said, voice hoarse. Eliot rose and poured another cup. His back was to Julian, but his words were deliberate. "Then why did you come at all?" Julian didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence did. And somewhere between the second cup and the second breath, Eliot knew. The real conversation had only just begun. The fire burned lower now, casting an amber glow that made the room feel smaller, closer, like the past itself had crept in from the cold to sit with them. Julian had grown quiet, cradling the half-empty teacup between his palms. His gaze drifted across the room as if he were looking for the version of himself he once left behind. Eliot sat opposite, composed, but there was a tension in him, coiled beneath the surface, like a violin string tuned too tight. He watched Julian, not with affection, but with a quiet ache that had grown colder over the years. There had been a time when he would have reached across the table to ease that silence, when one look from Julian would have been enough to unspool him. But those days had passed like seasons, long, beautiful, and gone. "Do you remember the night you left?" Eliot asked softly, not accusing, but invoking. Julian's fingers tightened around the cup. "Of course I do. You said you needed time. You said you'd write." Julian looked at him then, eyes hollow. "I did mean to. I didn't. Trust what I felt. It scared me." Eliot nodded slowly, his voice steady. "So you chose silence over honesty. You let me believe I imagined it all." Julian closed his eyes. "I told myself it wasn't the right time, that maybe we were too fragile. I met someone. He made it easier not to look back." A beat of stillness passed. Eliot did not flinch. He simply inhaled and let the truth land where it may. "And now?" Eliot asked. Julian hesitated. "He's gone. Left last spring." Eliot's jaw twitched, not from pity but from the cruel symmetry of it. "So now you remember me." "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that," Eliot said, his voice nearly a whisper. Julian looked away, ashamed or simply tired. "When I saw your letter, I thought maybe it was a sign. A chance to fix things." Eliot leaned back, studying. Him, some things can't be fixed, but they can be seen for what they were. Silence swelled again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was heavy with recognition, a shared understanding of the wound that had shaped them both. Julian reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a worn piece of paper. He placed it on the table without a word. Eliot recognized it. The letter he'd written, the one with no return address, only hope stitched between lines. "I've carried it since autumn," Julian said. Eliot didn't touch it. He looked only at Julian, the man who had once held his heart between uncertain hands. "Why come back now?" Eliot asked, not unkindly. Julian's voice cracked. "Because I never stopped wondering what we could have been." Eliot rose quietly. He walked to the window, watching the snow drift softly in the dark, and behind him, Julian sat still, waiting, perhaps, for forgiveness that might never arrive. The snow had thickened into silence, blanketing the world in a hush so complete it felt like time itself was holding its breath. Eliot stood by the window, one hand pressed against the cold glass, the other curled loosely at his side. Behind him, Julian remained seated, the cup empty now, the warmth of the tea long gone. But what lingered was something less visible, something neither of them had found the words for. "I didn't come here to make you forgive me," Julian said quietly. "I came because I couldn't carry the weight of it alone anymore." Eliot didn't turn around. His voice was calm, but worn. "And now you want to give it back to me?" Julian hesitated. "No. I want to leave it here. With you. Where it began." At that, Eliot finally turned. His expression was unreadable, still, composed, but not indifferent. He walked back to the table and sat down, folding his hands in his lap, like someone preparing to receive confession. "There was a time," Eliot said, "when I would have let that be enough. When just having you in this room again would have broken me open." Julian looked up, shame flickering through his features like candlelight struggling in wind. "But not now?" he asked. Eliot shook his head gently. "No, because now no love should never come at the cost of vanishing." The words hovered for a moment. Julian nodded slowly, accepting them. He looked smaller now, like the version of himself Eliot once knew. The one who always stood too far back in photographs, who never said quite enough when it mattered. Eliot reached for the folded letter, opened it, and placed it between them. "This wasn't a trap," he said. "Not some punishment wrapped in ritual. It was a goodbye. I just wanted to look at you and know that I was no longer waiting." Julian exhaled, brokenly. "Then you've already moved on." "No," Eliot said, softly. "I let go." Outside, the snow began to soften again, the flakes light and airy, as if the storm had exhausted itself. Julian stood slowly, the old creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, louder than either of their voices. "I'll go," he said. Eliot nodded. "Leave the letter. Take the cup." Julian blinked. "Why?" "Because I don't want it anymore," Eliot replied, eyes warm but firm. "And you'll need something to remember that not everything sweet is meant to last." Julian held the cup for a moment. Then, with a quiet breath, he slipped it into his coat pocket. At the door, he paused. "You were always the braver one." Eliot looked at him one final time. "No, I was just the one who stayed." The door clicked shut behind him. And in the quiet that followed, Eliot poured the last of the tea down the sink, then sat by the fire, letting the warmth reach the place in him that had waited too long to heal.